Thank you for checking out this video with Dr. Autistic. Please check out my other videos as well, as you can see in the descriptor. I've been getting some flack from my colleagues and from the public when I ask important questions. I ask difficult questions. As a psychologist, as an educator, as somebody who goes in the media a lot, I try to present facts as much as I can. I also try to do it in a very compassionate manner, but a truthful manner, an honest manner. And I believe that we need science, we need evidence to help direct policy, to help parents or others make important choices for their children or for themselves. And we can't do that if we're only being driven by the ideology of the day rather than what's in the best interest of the people that we are trying to assist. And so at one point, a little while back on Twitter, I had tweeted something about some trans issues. I got a lot of flack from certain people, and one of the people who wrote to me, in fact, was telling me about another aspect of this story, and I thought it would be important to have her on. She's using a pseudonym, and just to protect her identity and her daughter's identity, we've blocked out her face, and so her pseudonym is, and she's going to tell her story, and we're going to have a discussion about another aspect of trying to deal with very complicated, and let's be clear here, issues that do not have any easy answers. If anybody ever says that the science is in on something to do with gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, sexual identity, anything having to do with these types of issues, there's a wave recently. There's a movement. There are, political advocates here trying to do the right thing. I do believe they have the right intentions, but in some cases, more harm than good is transpiring. And here's one mother who experienced that. So I'm going to have Catherine Cave come on and tell her story. And just by presenting this information doesn't make me a transphobe. It does not make her a transphobe. Throwing these labels around are not helpful. It's important to hear other people's lived experiences, and just because these experiences might not jibe with what you would like to think doesn't make it wrong and doesn't make it worthy of discussion. So Catherine, thank you for coming on and discussing this very difficult issue.
Thank you for letting me share my story. This started for me when my daughter was 13 years old, and she, without any warning signs, told me one day that she was transgender, that she was my son.
Now, before she came out with this proclamation, so you say she was about 13, and you said, I know a bit of your backstory, so this was a couple of years ago?
Yes.
Okay, so she's now 15, 16?
She's 16 now.
She's 16, okay. So prior to her coming out in this manner, were there any signs, any indications that she may have had any questions about her gender identity?
There were no signs that I saw that she felt uncomfortable being a girl, either with feminine choices that she made, wearing princess costumes and dresses, even the type of play that she had. It was always sort of stereotypical girl. From her body, she showed no signs of hating her breasts when they came in, no discomfort when she started her period. This was truly out of the blue. The only thing that I observed that might be a little different is that she didn't fit in socially. She especially didn't fit in with the girl groups. So her few friends were usually boys. That was the only thing that I would say was a little different when I look back.
Right, but you're saying, though, that she dressed like a princess and so on, so it wasn't even as if she was, being a tomboy or anything like that.
No, never a tomboy.
Okay. And when did she start hitting puberty?
She hit puberty about 1.5 years before she came out to me.
Okay, so she had already started developing, so just so that the audience is clear, she had started to develop in the way that a preteen would start to develop. And throughout that year or so, 1.5 years, there were no indications that this transition that she was going through was in any way distressing, uncomfortable, anything like that.
Not at all. She seemed actually to take pride in developing a woman's body. I never saw her hide her breasts or be ashamed of them. She wore body-hugging clothing, all very gender-specific.
Okay. So you have a daughter, she's 13 and a bit, and she's telling you now that I'm your son, not your daughter. And so you, as her mother, what's the first thing that you did to address this?
First thing is I told her I love and accept her no matter what, and that is the absolute truth. But then I needed to have time to understand what this was. And after reading and thinking about it, I assumed it had to be a phase. She couldn't possibly be transgender because it didn't fit with what I understood to be a typical transgender experience.
Now, when you say what you understood, this is after you did research into this phenomenon?
This is after I read books and read stories on the internet. And because it didn't make sense to me, I did not encourage my daughter to change her name or dress like a boy. But this lasted a lot longer than I had hoped.
Okay, so how long did it last until you took the next step? And in that time, until you did take that step, what was she doing as far as expressing this new identity or this burgeoning identity?
This was nothing she expressed outside of the home, but because it was becoming more important to her to live as she felt she should as a boy, I finally decided I needed to see a specialist. So we saw a gender therapist.
Okay, and just I guess for practicality's sake, did you get a referral from your family physician, or how did you seek this person out?
I found this person by making phone calls and interviewing different people on the phone to try to find someone who had a lot of experience in dealing with children who identified as transgender.
All right. So this person wasn't perhaps operating outside of the scope of their professional practice?
No.
Okay.
It was not.
All right, so you went to this person, seeming professional, seeming to know what he was doing, and what did he advise you as soon as you did that? And by the way, were you going alone? Were you going with your husband?
I went alone with my husband, the two of us, and he discounted, first of all, the lack of history with my daughter, the fact that it came out of the blue, and the fact that many students at her school also identified as transgender. He did not see that as being significant. He seemed to take the stance that a child who asserts this is transgender, that they know who they are. And he said that my husband and I needed to support this, to support her social transition, because she would be at risk of suicide, or she is at risk of suicide by identifying as being transgender. And he said that the greatest predictor of whether or not children do commit suicide is the support or lack thereof from their parents.
Okay. And I mean, that is something that is quite common in the literature, both of the things that you said, that trans people are at extremely high risk of suicide or suicidal ideation or attempts, and B, as you said, that one of, if not the most important predictor is the support or lack thereof from family. So in that regard, forgetting everything else that you're about to tell me, did you feel that part made sense as far as just being supportive for your daughter as she's trying to navigate through this difficult period?
At the time, I felt I had no choice but to follow his recommendations. Okay. In retrospect, I don't feel that the statistics that he cited were necessarily predictive.
In what way?
I feel that, first of all, the statistics often cited are not for children. They're for transgender adults.
Sure, yeah.
Who are already a self-select group, who are at high risk for various reasons. Whether or not it's because they identify as transgender or have those feelings, there's often so many comorbidities,
right,
that I feel it's impossible to tease out. So to tell a parent that their full 100% support of a social transition is the key to preventing their child's suicide, I feel is highly irresponsible.
Okay, now it's very important because one of the things that I try to do in my interviews with people about these controversial issues is to avoid black and white and find some nuance or appreciate the nuance that is called for in these kinds of situations. So help me or help the audience find the balance. So instead of saying outright, yes, you must 100% support your child in this desire to transition, how do you find a balance where you say, I'm going to be supportive of my child to help them navigate through this while not necessarily kind of pushing them in a direction of this choice, which, because I don't know if this therapist discussed the stats of and I don't have them right off the top of my head. I've done this in other interviews where the majority of children who do at some point say, when they're children, they just don't feel comfortable in their physical sex. The majority, after puberty, they end up saying, I'm okay. I am who I am, and this is who I am. And, and they kind of grow out of it, so to speak, right? There are stats to show that. I just don't have the exact numbers with me. So how does a parent show support for the child as a human being in a difficult situation without pushing them in a particular direction that you're going to tell us about, how it got quite inappropriate in your daughter's case? What would the balance be?
Well, I'm just a parent who has one perspective with my child. But based upon my story and based upon learning about other people who have a similar situation than I do, I feel that to push kids or to encourage the social transition without a full and deep exploration as to the whys, as to the underlying issues, is so important, because once you get a child on that path, once you have a therapist basically rubber stamping a child's self-diagnosis, so to speak, it's very difficult to question. Once you've had a therapist rubber stamp a child's self-diagnosis, once you've had a therapist say to parents, you must support this social transition, how do you go backwards? How do you allow a child to explore the underlying issues that might be at the heart of it when, if left alone, as you mentioned, a lot of the statistics show that these kids do not need to transition. Mm-hmm. So once you get on that path, what is the next step after social transition? Finding the breast. What is the next step? Hormone blockers. What is the next step? Cross-sex hormones. These things are not without serious psychological and medical consequences.
Okay, and can you say how...
slow this down.
Right. So again, just so that it's clear though, if the therapist were less, let's say, reckless in pushing for that one direction, what do you think a parent can do to show support for their child, to show that they accept the child for who they are, whatever that happens to be, while not, again, rushing toward a decision that, as you just laid out, had several major steps that can, at one point be very serious, especially if they go full transition. So, and the other steps that you mentioned as well are quite serious as well. So what does a parent say? What would you have wanted to say? How would you have wanted the therapist to have guided you to talk to your daughter to say, I support you, I love you, let's try to figure out what's going on here? How would you have wanted to have done that?
It's very difficult to parent at all a teenager, but especially one who has a belief that is so central to their identity, and to challenge that can be very difficult. Again, I'm not a trained therapist, but I would imagine through any good identity type work is to explore underlying issues, but in the process, what do you do at home? A parent's love for a child can be unconditional, but it doesn't mean that they unconditionally support every choice the child wants to make, whether it's binding breasts or doing things that are hurting their body. Now, if she wants to cut her hair, if she wants to go by a nickname, that's fine. That's part of figuring out who you are when you're a teenager. But when you take it further than that, that's when you don't allow the child, the teenager, to start thinking that, well, maybe it's something else. Maybe I'm not really a boy. Maybe I just like to hang out with boys, or maybe I'm a tomboy, or maybe I'm a lesbian. But when you have a therapist who doesn't allow for this exploration, how can a child respond other than proceed with what they think are the next steps for transitioning as a now identified transgender?
Okay, now some parents, and especially parents who are, maybe advocates for trans kids, would say that a non-trans child, a totally cis child, would never even go down this path to the degree that your daughter has gone, which I don't think there's any actual hardcore research to suggest that that wouldn't happen. When it comes to understanding why a child might feel the need to express themselves differently, to transition perhaps, or to at least have that in their mind. You're saying that there are background factors that should be considered and that weren't in your daughter's case. I know that at your daughter's school, other children had come out as transgender. There was a presentation at your school. I know a bit of background that you told me off camera. There was maybe a theme being presented in the school, and maybe children were joining in. And we know for a fact a lot of kids do trends or join trends that might not be true to themselves. For example, self-harm, where a lot of children might start harming themselves. A lot of children might start identifying as bisexual or lesbian or something that might not be true to their real identity, but being social animals, trying to figure out who we are. People try these things out sometimes. So these are all possible factors. And in your daughter's case, there's one other factor which really, I think, should have been considered by this therapist. And can you please share that?
Yes, my daughter is on the autism spectrum. And some of the characteristics as being on the spectrum is not enjoying stereotypical girl conversations and having great difficulty with those social conventions. Another part is a very rigid thinking, very inflexible thinking about things. So when ideas are presented to children on the spectrum like my daughter, they sometimes lack an other awareness about them, and they latch onto things, and it becomes very difficult to convince them otherwise.
And this therapist knew that your daughter was on the autism spectrum?
The therapist not only knew my daughter was on the autism spectrum, but suggested that that was why she was transgender. That people on the spectrum, they're more likely to identify as transgender. And quite possibly a reason why they're more likely is because they don't fit in with either gender.
Did the therapist provide any statistics or any research to support that?
There is research to support that it is more prevalent, but there is nothing to support the theory as to why.
So it's a correlation rather than causation.
Yes.
So in the therapist's mind, is he sort of seeing this as a kind of, I don't know, is that it's a weird treatment for the social aspect of autism? Because as we know that in many cases, as you were describing, depending on where they fall on the scale, how high functioning they are, would it be fair to say that your daughter would have been labeled as Asperger's previously before the change in
Yes.
the DSM? Okay.
Yeah, she's very high functioning.
Okay, so back in the days until 2013, when the DSM-5 put under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder, your daughter would have received the diagnosis of Asperger's syndrome, and the big part of it is this inability to pick up on social cues or to relate to others as most people do socially. So my question was: is the doctor saying then that that perhaps transitioning would assist her in this regard, or did he try to keep that separate, like as far as treatment for her Asperger's itself?
He did not say that explicitly. However, even knowing her rigid thinking, he didn't think it important to challenge or help her understand maybe why she identified as a boy. And I felt that the more therapy that went on, the more he was solidifying her rigid thinking. And that how would we know if she's not allowed to be questioned what this is until it's too late?
So just so people are clear, in this process, there was no talk of her undergoing therapy, not to solidify this belief, but rather to question why she might be feeling this way. That was never part of the equation?
That was not part of the therapy. The therapy was more about how to transition successfully at school, what binder to choose, talking about the next steps, asking my daughter what her next plans were. And after every therapy session, that's when I got a lot of demands for starting the hormone blockers and then the testosterone. And that's when I started getting really scared.
And so at the point that she's asking for testosterone supplements, the estrogen blockers, was she 14 at this time? 15? How old is she at this point?
Now she's 15 at this time.
At 15, okay. And you say that she's already bound her breasts. She's done that?
Yes.
Okay. Were you seeing at this time any obvious physical ill effects of binding?
I have not seen her body since she's transitioned. She's very private.
Has she shown then any medical distress in any way, any changes in her overall health over the process?
I have not known of any physical harms yet. I haven't seen them, but I fear the psychological harms.
You say fear, as in moving forward, or are you seeing signs in this process that she's undergoing some psychological distress, discomfort, confusion?
My fear is that she has become so convinced by herself, so convinced by her school, and so convinced by her therapist that she is transgender and that she needs to medically transition in order to be a happy, healthy person. She has quoted suicide statistics to me. And my fear is that when you have a vulnerable child who has received these messages, it can become a self-fulfilling prophecy.
So if a parent says, what if you are wrong and this is the right path, you've done the right thing, so shouldn't you be happy? Let's say somehow there was a way to determine, a genetic code was found or anything like that where we could say 100% this was the right thing. Would you still say it was imposed on her? It was too reckless, even if it's the right thing for her, would you still say that this was handled wrong?
Yeah, I would think it was handled wrong if that person didn't know 100% this is the right thing, but that's a pure hypothetical. And the fact is, none of us know the future. This is an experiment on children right now. We don't have long-term data about the medical impact. We don't have long-term data about what is going to happen to this crop of kids who now think they are transgender if we just left them alone and gave them good old-fashioned therapy. We don't know. So you are left as a parent to figure this out on your own and perhaps trust the wrong therapist in the process. So it's a very scary place to be in. In just a few years, my daughter can make her own medical decisions, and I will have no legal say in them.
And I don't know what kind of backlash you've received in questioning the process. How public has this process been, and what kind of feedback have you got, whether it's as a pseudonym or in real life? What can you share what's happened to you?
Yeah, so most people, when I share with them as a pseudonym, assume that I am just a bigot, that I'm a transphobe, that I just can't accept not having a daughter. And there is nothing farther than the truth, because when I allowed my daughter to transition, I was fully accepting what I thought to be the truth at that time. And it has only been through more time and knowing my daughter and talking to other people who have experienced the same thing that I have felt that that was the wrong decision. This is not a political issue. This should not be framed as a political issue. This should be framed as a medical issue, a psychological issue, and a personal issue. And it offends me when people who don't know me, don't know my family, don't know my daughter, make assumptions about my life and about the choices that I'm making. And it's extraordinarily difficult.
Right.
I will also say, from being on the other side, because I have been part of support groups with other parents who are going through this and have been transitioning their children, I also feel for people on the other side who disparage them. They may be making the absolute wrong decisions for their kids, and I think in many cases they absolutely are. But I also know that they are probably doing the best that they can with the information that they have. So the bottom line is that therapists have got to be allowed to question why a child feels this way and not automatically label and assume that a child's self-declaration should be met with 100% affirmation, followed by social transition, followed by medical transition, because that is absolutely the path that my daughter was set upon. There has to be a way to affirm a child and to love a child without affirming this self-diagnosis in the process.
Right. And you see, now in Toronto, there was a gender identity disorders lab, in the old term, then gender dysphoria. It was one of the biggest in the world. And it seems that the kind of the mandate there was to do exactly what you had suggested, which is to question. Now, I don't want to speak for the head of that lab. I want people to understand that in your case, you are a parent dealing with a child going through a very difficult issue. As you say, I mean, these are like potentially permanent, lifelong effects that she could undergo. If she decides to stop at some point, who knows what's being done to her hormonally, for example, even without the surgery itself. As you say, the psychological effects, we don't know what happens if someone tries change. Well, there are some case studies, but on a grander scale, we don't know what happens if someone lives part of their life one way, and then they're being told you're one way, and then they have this identity struggle, saying, okay, maybe this really isn't me. I mean, there are so many issues that we don't know. And so again, I'm not going to speak for Dr. Zucker because that's his own issue, but his lab seems to have tried to help children to figure out who they are, what they want to be, and got shut down, it seemed, for political reasons. There were allegations made against him that were unfounded. They were proved to be unfounded. Yet I also know some people who knew other people who went to the lab who felt that maybe there was too much of a push in that other direction, which was pretty much, regardless of who you think you are, what you feel like you are, we're going to make sure that no, you are a boy. You're physically a boy, you're going to be a boy. Or you're physically a girl, you're going to stay that way. There were those claims. And the reason I'm saying this is that people see the headlines, they have their ideology already stamped in, and they start seeing this as a pet project or as a cause to celebrate or to fight against. And again, sometimes they forget that throughout all of this, there are real people involved. And that's why I wanted to bring a real person, and again, using the pseudonym Betty Black. I am very thankful and appreciative that you did share your story, and I'm going to let you say more things that you'd like to say, but I just want people to understand why I wanted to bring a person here. Apologies for the blurred screen, but you are trying to protect your daughter's identity. You're not doing this out of, for some desire for notoriety. You just wanted an opportunity to share your story and to bring, again, a real lived experience to the narrative rather than just all the politics and, again, all the posturing and people trying to, be slacktivists or SJWs or something else. I mean, there are real people involved. So again, thank you for sharing your story. So can you give an update on what's happening with your daughter now? What are the plans? And, where do you take it from here?
Well, I wish that I had a happy ending for you, but we are still trying to figure this out. We're no longer seeing the therapist. When I finally woke up and realized that he was pushing her on a path toward medical transition without working on the underlying issues. We are now seeing a therapist who has been helpful in trying to support my daughter. But because this is so entrenched right now, this is very, very difficult work for the therapist. As far as being a mom to this, there's not a minute of the day that I don't think about this in some way. It's always in my thoughts. I dream about this. First and foremost, I want my daughter's mental health and physical health to be preserved. And I worry that when she becomes a legal adult, that if she doesn't figure this out, that she may be making some serious, irreversible medical decisions.
I'm assuming she still lives at home with you?
Yeah, she still lives with us.
What is it like then on a day-to-day basis? Is she working with you? Is she resentful of the fact that you're trying to help her understand this better? What's it like in the home?
We try not to talk about this because when we do, she's very resentful about the fact that I will not go along with her plans for medical transition.
And just so anyone watching is clear, because getting back to what I was saying before about CAMH, a lot of people were likening the gender dysphoria clinic to conversion therapy for homosexuality, saying that, they're trying to cure whether homosexuality or someone's gender identity. And that was the allegations and accusations made against Dr. Zucker and the clinic. Because again, people, as soon as they hear something that doesn't jibe with how they want to see an issue, they throw these labels: transphobe, homophobe, whatever else. So putting all that aside, I'm asking you directly, if this was done properly, your daughter comes to you at 13, says that she's now a boy, and you do your due diligence, find a therapist. The therapist works with your daughter. And again, I want everyone to understand this. I'm sorry to give all these long preambles, but without these, then I'm going to get labeled any which way you can imagine. So I want people to understand this. And by the way, I've worked with people with trans issues, only adults, because I work with adults or families. So I haven't had a child or a teen in this situation. I have worked with adults who have lived many years struggling with their identity, and I've helped them along the path, whichever is the path for them. But again, there's a huge difference between someone in their 20s, 30s, or 40s versus a teen. Especially someone who just had gone through puberty the year or so before. People have to understand that, or even younger, a child. So let's assume, same thing, your daughter's 13, tells you that she is a boy, you go to therapy, and she spends years in therapy, and in the end she finally says, I know for fact I was born in the wrong body. I need to transition. And she's a bit older at that point, and what would you do in that case?
Well, it's my personal belief, after reading different stories, especially detransition stories of adults, that if she were a minor, I would not support that transition, because I still would not be convinced. If the frontal lobe of the brain does not fully develop until the age of 25, 26,
Mm-hmm.
and if you have autistic thinking, which even slows the development even more, I would hate to base an irreversible medical decision on something that I could not be convinced is the absolute right thing to do. So the answer to your question is, for me to support that, it would have to be her after the age of 25, 26, after a lot of really good therapy. But that's my opinion.
Okay. And again, so people are clear. So if she were past the age of 25, gone through all the therapy and says, this is who I am, it's not this, the wrong, I'm in the wrong sex, I want to transition. You would support that then, you're saying, if she were an adult at that point, past 25?
I will support my daughter through unconditional love no matter what she chooses.
Okay.
I will not financially support a medical choice if I don't believe that it is necessary for her well-being.
Because people are just too quick to just dismiss you as a transphobe. No matter what you say, they're going to say that. So they might say, okay, well, he's asked her all these questions, yet in the end, her wording is, regardless, you won't support if you don't think it's medically sound or warranted. So I just want to be clear, because I want to know from my perspective, if she had gone through all this therapy, she were in, an adult in her 30s even, and said that she's feeling great distress over this, physical sex that she's in, would you then support the transition medically and financially at that
If
point?
I felt that it was medically necessary to support her mental health, then yes, I would support her in that way.
Okay. And I'll tell you right now, I mean, I tried to ask as clear as possible, but people will still say that. You say, well, if I felt, I'll tell you right now, I mean, they're going to interpret that and say, well, no matter what the evidence is, even 10 years of therapy, she will still say, well, I don't feel it's correct. So you would still deny it, is what you're going to be accused of. That's
Again, coming from what I've experienced, I have a great deal of cynicism for most professionals right now, from my experience in talking to different therapists and medical doctors as to what their practice is. So forgive me for that, but that is why I have to feel comfortable with something. And in your hypothetical, I wouldn't automatically just accept that just because some therapist says that this is what you should do, that is what you should do.
right.
It
Well,
would have to make sense to me.
well, again, that's why I tried to frame it as, we're talking at that point, it would have been over 10 years of therapy for your daughter, 10 years of, living life one way and trying it and seeing. And okay, so that's why I was trying to frame it, that it wasn't just the say-so of one therapist. Because, and I've gotten in trouble with my own colleagues for questioning whether therapists who are saying the kinds of things that you're saying, whether they are basing it on sound evidence or whether it is ideology. And quite frankly, from what I'm seeing, I am hearing a lot of ideology, whether it's among psychologists, my profession, whether it's in academia, whether it's medical doctors. And I don't know if you saw the program. It was a Toronto program. I've been on it myself, TVO's The Agenda, where Dr. Jordan Peterson, who has brought attention to this issue, although for him it wasn't the trans issue, it was more about free speech. This was the context in which everything happened. But there was a professor, I think he was a historian of science or of medicine, Nicholas Maté, and he went on TVO's The Agenda, and he said very clearly that I can tell you without a shadow of a doubt that the scientific community has determined over the past 50 years that physical sex does not exist, that it's a construct. So X, Y, XX, those kind of chromosomal patterns, irrelevant. It doesn't exist. So what I'm trying to say is, and people don't like to hear that because he falls into the right camp, the quote unquote right camp these days. When someone can say that, instead of saying maybe for some people gender is a construct, maybe there's, these gender norms or gender expectations and roles we know for a fact have a cultural influence to them. But that's about as far as I'm willing to go. Instead of just saying that, people are saying either A, gender in of itself is completely a societal construct, despite all the evidence to the contrary, and B, even further, that, again, physical sex is a construct. So regardless of what your X, Y, or XX pattern is, you can choose to be one way or another. So when people are coming on TV, they're going into classrooms, they are saying these kinds of things. And this is more not me talking to you, Betty Black, but more to the audience. So they can kind of understand where a parent might be cynical, as you say, might be hesitant. The fact is, there is a lot of ideology being rammed down people's throats. And by my highlighting that in no way makes me a transphobe. In their eyes, it might. And, all I can do is, and again, I've had to fight with my own colleagues over this. All I can do is live every day in my professional capacity and my personal role, being supportive of people for, whoever they are, whatever they are, respecting their dignity, helping them find out what is distressing them, seeing if there are any ways to help remedy what they may be going through, and using the tools at our disposal, but in a very proper manner. And I think from what your experience is, I speak as a psychologist, you're speaking as a mother whose daughter is, going through this experience. You haven't been convinced that sound medical, psychiatric, and psychological theory and practice is going into these decisions, is what I'm hearing. And I think people need to hear that rather than just dismissing you as a horrible mother, transphobe, et cetera, who, just wants to condemn your daughter to a lifetime of misery. You're trying to do the opposite. I'm sorry to put all these words into your mouth, but I think it's important to try to meld the two, your personal experience and what I've seen professionally, which is not instilling a lot of confidence in people such as yourself and your family trying to find out what's best for your daughter. Is that a fair, very verbose way of saying that, capturing what your experience?
I would agree with that, yes.
And throughout this whole discussion, we've been referring to your child as your daughter, as to her and she. And so many people would say that right now we are committing, at least in Canada, perhaps hate crimes because we are dead naming her. We are not saying him and he and your son. So, just by the very nature of the way we've spoken, we've already proven ourselves in other people's eyes to be horrific monsters. What has it been like on your end as far as referring to your child as your daughter and she and her? What happens there? Does she say something to you? Do others say it to you?
I actually did use pronouns, her chosen pronouns, when I was supporting the transition. And now I just don't use anything. I don't use daughter. I don't use her. I have other names that I use, pet names, to refer to my daughter. And that's my way of affirming her in our relationship, but also not affirming something that she believes is her true identity and I believe is not.
Okay. And so from my perspective, I'm not talking to your daughter, I'm talking to you. So I'm not going to defy your language, say defy and define it and say, no, I'm going to call her your son, or je or je or something like that. So this is not meant as disrespect to your child. And if I was speaking with her, I would, out of respect to her, because it's not my child, I would just, as a human being in front of me personally, if she asked me to refer to her as him or he or some other, gender neutral pronoun, whether, they or them, I'm okay with. I'm not okay with all these made up terms, only because, like Jordan Peterson, I'm afraid of the politics behind them. But I would use they or them if that's what your daughter wanted, just because if talking with her face to face. But in talking to you, I don't mean to be dead naming your child. Again, it's out of respect to you. I'm talking to you face to face. But again, I hate to have to use all these caveats, but without them, and even with them, I am still going to be branded, all these terrible things. And that's one of the reasons why you're not getting a platform, because people are afraid to say, again, the science is not clearly in. We don't know if we're doing more harm than good in some of these cases in pushing an ideology onto real human beings, that they're the ones who have to potentially bear the scars psychologically and literally. So again, I'm sorry for all these caveats. It's just I have to protect myself professionally. And again, notwithstanding all this, I will still be labeled as someone terrible for daring to A, have you on as a guest, and B, commit all these transgressions that I've done in talking with you that shows a lack of sensitivity. This is the society that we live in today. And I, for one, think it's a good thing to be more sensitive to people's experiences, to recognize that not everybody fits into this cookie cutter mold of how people are quote unquote supposed to be. I think it's important, but I think it's gone overboard. And again, it seems like certain people are pushing an ideology and not thinking about the potential consequences and the real life consequences on a lot of people. And I only hope that whatever happens moving forward, that you do get the help, or your daughter particularly gets the help that she needs, and is able to find out what the best choice in life is for her, and that she can live a happy, productive life to the best of her ability or capacity. And feel free to contact me and update me with anything that might happen, and I'd be happy to have you on again. And again, I'm just trying to bring real life stories, real life people to this very complex situation. It shouldn't just be a theoretical or an ideological debate. We have to consider the real people who are affected. So is there anything else that you wanted to say with respect to what we've been talking about?
No, I just thank you for letting me share a different perspective that is not normally covered with the mainstream media, unfortunately. So thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome. And when you see the backlash that I get, you'll know why it's not really that covered. I can only hope that people will listen with an open mind and see it's two people here from very different positions here. I'm just a professional. You're a mother of a child who's going through this and who's gone through the system, and you feel that you were sent in a wrong direction. And by the way, one last thing, the therapist who is helping your daughter now, how did they react to hearing the treatment that she was receiving prior to coming to her?
She thought it was appalling.
Okay. But she didn't say that she was going to make any professional complaints or anything like that?
No, I did also consult with an autism expert who thought it was malpractice.
Again, people have to appreciate that. I mean, even the fact that, just a little bit of a side note here, this is a false ending here, but even the fact that there's no longer a term Asperger's, it's under the umbrella of autism spectrum disorder. This is not nature. This is a human being or a collection of human beings who looked at the research, looked at the clinical experience, maybe were guided by the ideology and made these decisions. And we still don't know whether these are the right or wrong decisions. This is all works in progress, and people have to understand that. And in this year, 2017, this is what some people are thinking. And I don't know. Nobody knows what percentage of people disagree with these types of decisions, whether it has to do with mental health, whether it has to do with one's identity. We still don't know that. And so for people to jump on and say, no, this is the right way, it's reckless, can be dangerous. And I just want people to just, again, not just jump in with both feet. Take a prudent stance and try to see whether what we're doing truly is the healthiest and most adaptive way. Because to think of the children going through this, whether children, adults, adolescents, as guinea pigs is wrong. And it's the same with medications, that so many people, whether it's, again, for the hormone blockers, whether it's for, depression or anything else, it's always a work in progress. So I wish people would just realize that there's no hard facts in all of this. We're still trying to figure things out. And so once again, thank you for being a real person, bringing a real story into this endeavor and trying to figure it out. So again, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
All right, take care. And again, please keep me posted.
Okay, you take care. Bye-bye.